Okay, picture this. It's 6:47 a.m. The sun is just starting to peek over the massive smokestacks of an industrial refinery. Inside the control room for Unit 12, everything is completely chilled out. You've got green lights gently flickering on the panels. A technician in his hard hat is taking a slow sip of his morning coffee, just kind of scanning the digital displays. He's totally at ease. Why? Because the numbers right in front of him are perfectly reassuringly steady. But here's the thing, he has absolutely no idea that the reality behind those numbers is a total fiction. He is calmly trusting a gauge that is literally lying to his face. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack exactly how one single broken number managed to bring down a colossal behemoth of steel. So inside that quiet control room, the needle is dead flat. It's telling everyone that everything is perfectly normal. But just 200 feet away, shrouded in heavy, hot vapor, behind this massive bolted pipeline valve that absolutely nobody is watching, violent physics are taking over. Internal thermal pressure is just climbing exponentially. It's pushing violently outward against heavy steel pipes, making them actually vibrate and groan under the stress. The math has completely failed at this point. But the screen says we're all good.
19. I really want you to think about that number. That is exactly how many days this specific pressure gauge had been frozen. For 19 solid days, its internal mechanics had shifted, a microscopic layer of dust had settled in, and it had just been feeding this steady, flatlining stream of fake data to the operators. 19 days of a silent, ticking deception that ultimately sealed the fate of the entire facility.
Section 1. Anatomy of the plant. Let's take a quick look at the original design.
Decades ago, when this plant was built, it was meticulously engineered. The core operation is pretty straightforward. Inside this massive distillation column, crude oil is intensely heated until it separates. Now, naturally, boiling oil generates extreme internal pressure. To handle that, the engineers came up with a brilliantly simple safety mechanism, an emergency relief valve. Its entire job, literally the only reason it exists, was to vent that rapidly expanding steam upward and out before the stress on the steel walls reached a critical breaking point.
But how does the system actually know when it's time to open that valve? Well, it all came down to one critical sensor, one single analog pressure gauge reading PSI and bar. Every copper data cable, every operator's handwritten logbook, every single redundant safety protocol, and literally every life or death decision made in that control room depended entirely on that one number being absolutely 100% accurate. And this brings us to a really devastating concept in forensic investigations. You see, this plant wasn't taken out by a bomb. It wasn't sabotage. It was destroyed by something way more mundane. Paperwork. We call it death by 1,000 approvals. It happens when an entire organization fails, not because someone pushed a giant red self-destruct button, but through a really slow, cascading chain of tiny, seemingly harmless bureaucratic errors that everyone just casually signs off on.
Section 2. The chain of errors. The quiet change that started it all.
The contrast here is kind of mind-blowing when you dig into it. The original gauge, it was perfectly rated for the old, safe operating range. But then, management decided to push for new, hyper-compressed capacity upgrades to increase throughput. The sheer volume of new pressure meant this aging gauge was suddenly being forced to operate right at the absolute razor's edge of its calibration limits. Its tiny internal mechanical springs were being shoved hard into the danger zone every single day, warping just a tiny, microscopic fraction over time.
And here is where we find the very first major crack in the chain. It wasn't a broken part, it was a broken conversation. Engineering officially stamped and signed off on that capacity upgrade to push the plant harder. Awesome, right? Except the maintenance department was never actually told that the increased load meant they needed to flag this specific gauge for an earlier recertification. Two different corporate hallways, two different teams, and absolutely zero communication connecting those vital decisions. When you map it out, this forensic cascade is terrifying. It shows exactly how disconnected decisions stack up. It started years prior with that capacity upgrade. Then, weeks before the incident, the scheduled recalibration was entirely missed because of that communication gap. 19 days prior, the fatal human error actually happened, and it all culminated right at 6:53 a.m. It's like watching an invisible ticking time bomb being slowly assembled by human and organizational drift.
Let's zero in on that specific moment, 19 days prior. Look, gauges drift over time. It's just physics, which is exactly why we have inspection schedules. But on this particular day, a deeply exhausted technician who was working a brutal double shift stood in front of an empty inspection logbook. Instead of going out and performing the recalibration, he just hastily scribbled a blue ink checkmark into a tiny white box to save some time. In that exact fraction of a second, he officially turned every single future reading into a lie wearing a data uniform.
Section 3. The breaking point. Pressure with nowhere to go.
The suspense is honestly unbearable when you think about these two realities happening simultaneously. Inside, the operators are just sipping their coffee, staring at screens feeding them safe, flat green numbers. But out in the yard, the reality is dark and terrifying. The thick metal seams of the colossal tank are actively warping. Invisible structural shearing is happening under extreme hidden loads. The base metal is literally stretching out like taffy.
Because that broken gauge was reading low, the massive mechanical relief valve never got the signal to open. Its springs just remained locked down tight. The steel tank had absolutely no path to safely transfer or release this monumental building stress. And as the old engineering adage goes, steel does not bend politely when it's overloaded, it finds its own path.
4 seconds. That is literally all it took. At 6:53 a.m., the tank wall finally reached its ultimate failure point. The very first rivet snapped, and in less than 4 seconds, the massive storage unit catastrophically ruptured. The sheer force launched tons of concrete and twisted steel shrapnel hundreds of feet into the dark sky. The resulting shockwave was so incredibly violent that it shattered office windows nearly a mile away.
Section 4. Written in blood. The aftermath.
It took months, but forensic teams eventually pulled the maintenance logs from fireproof lockers and traced the disaster back to that single falsified record. This sparked sweeping, massive industry reforms. Moving forward, redundant sensors became absolutely mandatory. Relying on a single point of failure was no longer tolerated. Maintenance sign-offs now required a second set of eyes, independent verification, making sure no single tired technician ever had to carry the full weight of a facility's safety on their shoulders alone. And crucially, any capacity upgrade instantly triggered a mandatory recertification of the entire connected system. Today, you're going to find this exact disaster profiled in university lecture halls all across the globe. It's become a foundational case study in engineering ethics. And the crazy thing is, it's not taught because the thermal physics or the structural calculations were incredibly complex. Not at all. It is taught because the root cause was so deeply, tragically human. A failure of two departments to talk to each other and one exhausted worker trusting a tiny shortcut. So the next time you find yourself rolling your eyes at a mandatory inspection or grumbling about a redundant piece of paperwork, I want you to remember this. Almost every single line in a safety manual is a memorial to a gap that nobody saw until it was far too late. These codes aren't just annoying bureaucracy. They are quite literally written in blood. Because engineering isn't just about steel and calculations. It's a promise that the numbers we use can actually be trusted with human lives.
And I think that leaves us with a pretty sobering reality to reflect on. In our own work, in our own daily routines, we all rely on systems, right? We rely on data and on the signatures of other people. We just assume the gauge is right, but the chain of safety is really only as strong as its weakest link. So I'm going to leave you with this to think about. When was the last time you verified a number that you trusted with someone's life?